great to be back over here in, where am I tonight? Morristown.
Gotham City.
Y'all laugh, but I mean, y'all are like number 64 this year of places, groups that I've went out and spoke with, and it kind of, well, I spent a lot of time on the road. I'm going to do something even different. I'm going to start different this evening than I have in the past, and I've done this a few times. I'm going to take a quiz. Give y'all a quiz. How much do you know about Hamlin County and the 1860s? Now, as I travel around talking about Kirk's raids through the Blue Ridge, I've been going to these counties and I've been asking that question. Because we, as SCB members and UDC members and Historical Society members and association members and just general people interested in history, we're the ones that need to know this stuff and pass it on to other people. Now, I probably have most of y'all nervous out here. And you can say, well, I'm not from here. Well, I go a lot of places I'm not from, but I love the history of those places. Quiz. How many people lived here in 1860? How many white folks, slaves, free people of color? How big was Hamlin County?
Didn't exist.
Didn't exist. Thank you. Where am I in 1860?
Well,
technically, you're in Jefferson County.
Jefferson County.
if you go to Main Street, you'll be in Granger County.
Granger County. Or in Hawkins. Okay.
So technically, you're in Jefferson County of the 1860s.
Who was your... How did the counties vote in 1860 for president? Are y'all Bell supporters or Breckenridge supporters? Or maybe even a few Douglas supporters? Was anybody brave enough here in 1860 to vote for Abraham Lincoln?
Wasn't even on the ballot.
You know, tomorrow I go talk to the Johnson County Historical Society over in Mountain City, Tennessee. And they're supposedly the most unionist county in East Tennessee. And we'll have the same conversation tomorrow. In someplace I was digging around online the other day, there was actually people there who voted for Abraham Lincoln. And you said it right just a minute ago. Lincoln was not on the ballot. North Carolina, to my knowledge, he was not on the ballot in Tennessee anyplace.
No, he wasn't.
So how can these people be voting for Abraham Lincoln when he's not on the ballot? So how did these counties vote? Did you support Breckenridge? Did you support Bell? Did you support Douglas? When the question about secession comes up, how did the counties vote? Are y'all for it? Are you against it?
East Tennessee was against it. Right. And then as you moved west, it became more prevalent.
That's true. Yes. How many Confederate soldiers came out of this area? How many Union soldiers came out of this area? How many Confederate soldiers deserted and crossed over?
A bunch.
How many of them just stayed at home?
A bunch.
And that's a conversation that we don't talk about, are all of these folks who are dissidents but get thrown into that unionist category. They're not pro-Confederate, they're not pro-Union, they just stay at home. Hide out in the woods. Go to my backyard and hide out. I like getting off of I-40, Route 160, because I can look over to the left, across the interstate, and see the mountains. See the Blue Ridge. And that's where our story takes us tonight. This book about George W. Kirk. And a lot of folks say, how can you write about a Yankee? Well, it's part of our story. It's a story that we need to be telling. Not everybody agrees with the story that I'm going to tell you tonight. We'll get to that conversation here in a minute. George W. Kirk, born down the road, Greene County, Tennessee, in 1837. He's a carpenter. He's a farmer. War starts, and I can't find George W. Kirk. Now, he may have joined a Confederate regiment and deserted. There's more than one George W. Kirk floating around in East Tennessee. Greensboro newspaper, Greensboro Patriot, writes after the war that, quote, during the first year of the war, George W. Kirk skulked in the woods, not identifying himself with either side of the belligerents. On account of his frequent raids on the defenseless women and children of the mountain districts of his state, Tennessee, Kirk was forced to seek shelter in the Laurel Mountains of Madison County in North Carolina. There's a chance that when the bridge burnings took place in November of 1861, Kirk was a part of that. And as you probably know, parts of that story, certain groups of men had to flee. And one of the places they went was the Laurel community in Madison County. Some folks call it the Shelton Laurel community. I have a good friend who's a member of the SEV camp in Madison County, North Carolina. And he has been working on that story, the Laurel War, for 20 years. And I hope he lives long enough to actually write it down. He's got reams of stuff that he's dug out over the years. First place I can really find Kirk is on July 1st of 1862 when he musters into the 1st Tennessee Cavalry U.S. And then he transfers to the 4th Tennessee Infantry U.S. And then finally he winds up in the 8th Tennessee Cavalry U.S. That's April 22nd of 1863. What Kirk is he's a recruiter. His job is to go out, find men, bring them into the Union Army. And as we get into 1863, he's recruiting for a regiment known as the 2nd North Carolina Mounted U.S. He's not a member, as far as I can tell, of that regiment, but he's recruiting for that group. And in 1864, he comes up with the idea, I've been doing all of this work. I should have my own regiment because I'm bringing all these guys in. And so he goes to his commanding officer in Knoxville, and he gets permission to recruit a group known as the 3rd North Carolina Mounted U.S. The folks in the 2nd are not too happy about that. Adjutant Charles Wilson of the 2nd writes to the Adjutant General in Knoxville about the matter. Wilson writes, he thinks that the recruits in Knoxville would be better employed in filling the ranks of the 2nd instead of trying to form a new regiment, the 3rd. Wilson writes that he had enough evidence to prevent George W. Kirk, quote, from ever holding a commission in the Union Army. I consider him unworthy of a position in the federal ranks or even among men, and from what I can learn, he is without honor or respect. Gosh, who needs enemies when you've got friends like this? But Kirk gets permission to raise his own group. And he's going to communities here in East Tennessee, and he's going across the mountain, western North Carolina, and he's recruiting these dissidents. Now, the folks who join, now let me say this. Anybody have ancestors in the 2nd or the 3rd North Carolina Mounted U.S.? I am so sorry.
He was a Confederate first, and he deserted because he didn't get paid, so he went to the Union Army so he could get some money.
I am so sorry.
I still count him as a Confederate soldier.
Most of these folks who joined the 2nd and the 3rd North Carolina Mounted U.S., not all of them, but a large chunk of them, are not interested in the war. Probably some of your kinfolk, too. That's probably why you wouldn't tell me names earlier.
Maybe.
They are not interested in preserving the Union. They're not interested in freeing the slaves. The vast majority of these folks enlist. They cross over the mountain. They enlist in Greenville or Knoxville, Strawberry Plains, Bulls Gap. They get a uniform, they get fed, get paid, get a gun, rifle. Some of them carried Spencers and Henrys. Those were probably private purchase, but they carried them. And then they crossed back over the mountain into western North Carolina in small groups and tormented their neighbors. That's the 2nd and the 3rd North Carolina Mounted U.S. In fact, the only time they ever really did anything as a regiment is Stoneman's Raid in March and April of 1865. Well, in May of 1864, Confederate High Command decide, hey, let's raid that railroad in central North Carolina. When the Confederates abandoned East Tennessee, September of 1863, they lost that direct route to the deep south. Ran from Bristol through Greenville, Knoxville, and Chattanooga. So now, if we're getting troops or supplies from one theater of the war, from the Western Theater into the Army of Northern Virginia, or vice versa, they either have to go through Charlotte and down toward Columbia, or they have to take another route further east along the east coast of North Carolina. So the Federals are saying, if we can hit that railroad coming out of Salisbury, High Bridge over the Yadkin River, we can further damage the Confederates' ability to get supplies, which shortens the length of the war. So they start looking for somebody to lead this raid. And who do they pick? George W. Kirk. Kirk had probably already been involved in the raid in Warm Springs, North Carolina, Hot Springs, in October of 1863. There's nothing right at that point in time that ties into that event, but there's some people after, a year after, 4 or 5 years after, saying that George W. Kirk is involved. So Kirk recruits, he takes some of his men that he's recruited. He gets some of the men from the 2nd North Carolina Mounted U.S. He gets 20 Indians, probably Cherokee, probably deserters from Thomas's Legion. Nobody actually goes that far, but they probably are. And he sets out from Knoxville. It's June of 1864. He goes to Greenville, and he kind of works his way toward the south. And in the little community of Broylesville, I think it's now in Unicoi County, he fights his first skirmish. There's a man there by the name of Captain Osborne. He has been sent to the community to look for George W. Kirk. And Osborne has captured a group, and he has taken them to Bristol, and he is on his way back when he runs into Kirk and his band. And Kirk gets the upper hand. He hears that Osborne is coming, and he lines either side of the road. The story says that it's in a wheat field. And he ambushes Osborne, and Osborne is killed. From that point in time, Kirk continues to work his way through the mountains. Goes across into the Crab Orchard section of Carter County, crosses Roan Mountain, probably the same route that the Over Mountain men took in 1780, and he works his way through present-day Avery County. It's June 27th of 1864. Kirk doesn't stop. He pushes his men all day and all night. And in the morning, or very early on the morning of June 28th of 1864, George W. Kirk is at a place called Camp Vance, 6 miles east of Morganton, North Carolina. It is where the railroad ends. Camp Vance had been around for a couple of years. It was opened and then closed and then reopened. It is a camp for conscripts. It is a camp for the new junior reserves. It is a camp for the senior reserves. If you're from the western part of the state and you're going home on furlough, you go to Camp Vance and get off the train and hopefully catch a wagon up the mountain someplace. Confederate conscription law has recently been expanded. We're taking 16, 17-year-old young men They're from the western counties of western North Carolina, or from the western counties of North Carolina. They are mobilizing there at Camp Vance. There's about 300 of them that have shipped out a couple of days prior. There are 240 junior reservemen there at Camp Vance at this point in time. I don't know how many other soldiers are at Camp Vance. There's probably a company or two of Mallett's Battalion. There's probably guards at Camp Vance. Don't know how many soldiers are in the guardhouse at Camp Vance. Maybe upwards of 300 guys. And here's George W. Kirk with his group of 100, 120 plus men. Now, to take a slight 90-degree turn, the internet has changed the way that I do research. Some of y'all have heard me say that before, but it has just revolutionized the way that the ability to do what I do. I never would have went to Vermont to find this story that I'm fixing to tell you. Never would have, in my wildest dreams, went up there and just pulled the book off the shelf and found this story. There's a soldier from a Vermont regiment whose name is Orrin Pine. And he is captured during the Battle of Cold Harbor, June of 1864, early June of 1864. And as he is making his way, I assume to Andersonville, someplace in between Salisbury and Charlotte, he jumps off that train and makes his way through western North Carolina. And someplace he runs into, so I guess here in East Tennessee, he runs into George W. Kirk. And Kirk hears about his story and hears about where he's said. And Kirk says, "Hey, why don't you join us?" Or it could have been, "Hey, why don't you join us?" I don't know. Pine doesn't actually go into that part of the story of why he joined, what coerced him to join with George W. Kirk. But he does, and after the war is over, Pine leaves us his story. This is what Orrin Pine wrote. It's June 28th, 1864. They're at Camp Vance just outside of Morganton, 6 miles east of Morganton. And here's Pine. And he writes, "Cautiously peering over a hill, we saw the men assembled for roll call and breakfast. It was arranged that instead of a charge, surrender should be demanded through a flag of truce. Colonel Kirk had a shirt which had once been white. This was torn and the flag attached to the 2 hickory sticks. And a young man, Coburn by name, on detached service from the 1st Ohio Heavy Artillery, together with myself, approached the guard, who greeted us with, 'Hello, Yank, come to give up your colors?' After stating that we had a message from the post commander, we were admitted to headquarters, where Lieutenant Bullock was temporarily in command. He had not arisen, but got up from his bunk at our admission when I saluted and handed him that order, which read, 'Commander, Camp Vance, you are requested to surrender this camp unconditionally in 5 minutes, by order of George W. Kirk, Colonel,' we've been promoted now, not officially, 'Colonel, commanding the 3rd North Carolina Mounted U.S. This was a high-sounding order for the leader of 100 men. Simultaneously with our entrance into headquarters cabin, a squad of Indians under Captain William Kirk and 25 white men under Colonel Kirk encircled the camp. Lieutenant Bullock came out of his room and said, 'Those Yankee son of a guns are all around us. How many men do you have?' 'Enough to annihilate this camp in 10 minutes, I replied. And after being assured that all would receive honorable treatment, the camp was surrendered without firing a gun. The Indians were placed about the camp, the arms were stacked, and the ammunition thoroughly guarded before the reserve over the hill was brought into camp and our real number disclosed.' There's about 120 of them. There's probably 300 Confederates at Camp Vance. We know there's 240 junior reserves. Don't know exactly how many more. So Kirk comes into camp, gathers up all of his prisoners. A small group of men go down a little ways down the railroad track to where the depot is, and what do they find? What do they find? They find a train. And that's what Kirk needs. Kirk even has a railroad engineer with him. Somebody who can fire that train up and take it down the tracks toward Salisbury, toward the High Bridge over the Yadkin River. So if we knock out that bridge, we've cut off rail traffic from Columbia and Charlotte, and Salisbury, and Lincoln. But Kirk doesn't take that train. My theory is that the telegraph officer at that depot fired off a message down the line saying that they were under attack. And then Kirk shoots him and takes his watch and burns the depot and burns the 3 or 4 rail cars and damages the engine and turns around and comes back to camp. Now, I can't say if that telegraph official had not tapped out that message, if Kirk might have got on that train and headed further east. I don't know. But he doesn't. Another group head toward Morganton. Some members of the Loudermilk family had already slipped into town and had warned the local people that Kirk's men were at Camp Vance. 50 of them, local men, old men, young boys, Confederate soldiers home on furlough, Confederate soldiers that have been discharged for various reasons, form a line across the road, and 2 of them go forward. One of them is W.W. Avery, former Confederate senator. The other one is Robert C. Pearson. And as the story goes, Pearson and another fellow whose last name was Irwin, they ride forward kind of like outposts or pickets, and they see the Federals coming across, and Pearson takes a shotgun and points it at the guy in the lead and pulls the trigger, supposedly muttering, "May the Lord have mercy on your poor soul." Kills that fella. His name was Hackney Norton, and the mule that he was riding on. So I imagine he got both barrels. That group, thinking they're under attack, turn around and head back to Camp Vance. At the camp, Kirk orders all of the buildings burned except the hospital. And the surgeon, the post surgeon, realizing what's going on, was taking as many men as he could get into the hospital. You're sick, and 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 you're sick. So by the time that is over with, he's got 70 people, men, in the hospital with him. Kirk orders all the rest of the buildings burned except the hospital, which is done. And then Kirk loads up with his prisoners, goes across the Yadkin River, goes a couple of miles north, and goes into camp for the night. Those 70 young men, I assume they were young, are not sick anymore. And they come out of the hospital and start to put out the fires. Unfortunately, the headquarters building with all of its papers was lost. None of that survived. If it was, maybe I could tell you how many men were there at Camp Vance. That evening, Kirk's men, they've been quiet. We've been quiet up to this point in time. That evening, his men start to roam and plunder the countryside. They go to people's houses. They steal everything that they can. And this is something that's been going on in the mountains of western North Carolina and East Tennessee almost since the war started. You have all of these small groups of men. Some of them are pro-Union. Some of them might be pro-Confederate. Majority of them are not really interested in either side whatsoever. They just want what you have. And the standard operating procedure is that they come to your cabin, knock on the door, beat the door in, go into your cabin, take the bed tick, the mattress off of your cabin, cut it open, empty the straw or the feathers, and take everything you have, including the clothes that you have on, and put it in that bed tick and ride off into the darkness. Sometimes they burn it down. Sometimes they don't. So you're left with what? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No food, no clothes, no blankets, nothing. It gets cold in the mountains in the wintertime. It's already snowed at my house twice. Month of November. So Kirk's men spread out in the surrounding countryside. Burning, plundering, robbing, murdering. That evening, Camp Vance, This is why I think the telegraph operator got that message out. 600 Home Guardsmen and Confederate troops, some of them from Salisbury, start to arrive. And on the morning of June 29th, they start in pursuit of George W. Kirk. And Kirk is working his way back up the mountain and back toward East Tennessee. Some of the local people ride ahead and try and get on either side or in front of George W. Kirk to try and slow him down, to ambush him and slow him down so the rear guard can catch up. They fight anywhere, at least 3, maybe 5 skirmishes as Kirk is going back up the mountain. Sometimes it's hard to try and decide if we're talking about the same event or if it's a separate event. In one of those skirmishes, where the Cool Springs Road intersects the road that Kirk is taking, can take you to the spot. Kirk takes some of his prisoners, those 16, 17-year-old kids, and lines them up and orders his men to lay down behind them and uses them as human shields, according to the newspaper articles of the time period. And then when the Confederates, the Home Guards, shoot their own prisoners, Kirk laughs about it, saying, "Look at the damn fools, they're killing their own men." It's in one of these skirmishes that George W. Kirk himself is shot in the arm, and his arm is broken. And one of his prisoners later writes that he regrets that that ball didn't break his neck. In another one of these skirmishes, there's W.W. Avery, William Waitskill Avery, former Confederate congressman. He's been sent back to western North Carolina to raise a battalion. Man by the name of Solomon Laws. Okay, Avery is leading this next attack. And there's one of Kirk's men by the name of Solomon Laws, and he recorded after the war, "After we fired a few rounds, the woods were full of smoke. I could see a white object dodging amongst the trees, and I kept throwing my 8-shooter on it as nearly as I could and firing as it moved from place to place. When the firing ceased and we started the position of the enemy, a comrade said, 'Laws, you sure did shoot like hell. And at the crack of your gun, I saw a white horse fall.' And Laws believed that he was the man that had mortally wounded Waitskill Avery. Avery was shot in the groin, and they took him home back to Morganton, and he lingered 3 or 4 days before he died." Fog soon covered the mountains, as it does so many times. For those of us that are friends here on Facebook, I don't put the fog pictures up very often because you can only see about 40 feet off the back porch of my house, and it's encased. As Kirk makes his way up through the Jonas Ridge community, he goes to the home of a man by the name of John Franklin. Kirk enters the home of John Franklin, but Franklin doesn't know that he's talking to George W. Kirk. Franklin looks at Kirk and he said, and this is one of the great benefits of living in a community that you write about. People bring you stories. That's an advantage that y'all have about being here. People will bring you stories passed down through their family. John Franklin turns to Kirk and he says, quote, "If I had some guns, I'd get Jack English and some other fellows and we'd kill that damn rascal." And Kirk looks at him and starts to take out his pistol and says, "Damn you, I am George Kirk." And Franklin's wife fell to her knees shouting, "Lord, don't let them kill John." And Franklin quickly replied, "Mr. Kirk, I always knowed you was not half as mean as they said you were." And Kirk spared his life. And after the war was over, John Franklin named his son George Kirk Franklin. I can take you to the cemetery where he's buried at. While Kirk is actually encamped that night we believe in the Crossnore community, probably half a mile from where I live. The field where he supposedly was camped in is owned by a guy in my camp. And yes, I've been over there, and no, I've not found anything. Nothing but beer cans.
Beer party.
That is beer.
Different time period.
And I asked the fellow in my camp about it, and he said, I hired some Mexicans to cut my corn. And apparently they like their corn, but I don't know.
They refined it a little bit.
They refined it a little bit. So Kirk is there. Two of the men that he has busted out of the stockade at Camp Vance, they are brothers. Last names are Clark. They volunteered to go and burn Colonel John B. Palmer's house. Palmer is colonel of the 58th Regiment, and by this point in time is in charge of the Department of Western North Carolina, which the Confederate government created after East Tennessee fell. Local historian wrote many years later that Palmer's house was the finest house in all of the Toe River Valley. He even had a piano. Can you imagine bringing that up the mountain? Wonder how he found somebody to tune it once he got it to the top of the mountain. Palmer's house is burnt. Chambers' house is burnt. They continue to rob and to steal horses. And Kirk eventually makes his way back across the mountain. Just 3 years after the war. 3 years. Now, as a historian, we're taught that the closer we get to the event, the closer the accounts that we use to the actual event, they're the more valid accounts. This was not written 100 years later. This is not a family story. I found this in a newspaper in 1868. A citizen was passing through some of the woods at the foot of Pink Mountain in Madison County when he found 5 piles of sun-bleached bones. He was told by the locals that they were the remnants of men captured at Camp Vance. These 5 had escaped and were trying to make their way back to their homes when they were caught by a band of robbers from Greene County. The 5 were taken to a secluded spot and they were all shot dead. The man who discovered the remains was looking for their families, and if no one came forward, was planning on burying them himself. He wrote 4 of them were men grown, and one was a very small boy, 15 or 16 years older. And then 2 years later, another story comes out. It's 1870. Possibly about the fate of some 8 or 10 of the boys that Kirk had captured. The article read, after getting them into Tennessee, it is said that Kirk allowed a few of them to escape. Having stopped on their return to North Carolina to get dinner, these unfortunate boys were overtaken by a detachment of Kirk's men and deliberately marched out from the house and shot. Benjamin Inman and William Sheltray of Madison County were present begging for the boys. It could be that these 2 accounts refer to the same event. I don't know that. I've often wondered how many times people going through the mountains, hunting, digging sand, looking for a place to put our still, found the piles of bones just like these. George W. Kirk and his band rode into Knoxville sometime around July 9th, 1864, to a hero's welcome. He was presented a uniform, a sword, and a sash by local citizens. One newspaper reported that Kirk was so, quote, overcome with emotion that he could make but a brief reply, but all could see that he felt volumes. Kirk goes on to be involved in other raids in that time period. E. Porter Alexander, who was with Longstreet's command just prior to this, noted in his book that Kirk and his band would stop trains and rob them as they moved through the area. I've already mentioned the skirmish at Warm Springs or at Hot Springs. Kirk was probably involved in that. In March of 1864, Judge George W. Kirk accompanies Stoneman's men on their raid, but kind of, not exactly. Stoneman's men have come and have moved on, and George W. Kirk, with this time the 2nd and the 3rd, and he's been officially promoted to colonel. That was March of 1865. Kirk shows up afterwards. He builds 5 forts in Watauga County to protect Stoneman's line of retreat. They wouldn't have said retreat, they would have said his line of communications, but this is to protect Stoneman's line of retreat. Build 5 forts. If you've ever driven up and down the Blue Ridge Parkway, you've come really close to 3 of them. And from those forts, Kirk's men spread out into the countryside. Melinda Horton wrote after the war, her husband is Jonathan, a former Confederate soldier who's now in the state Senate, writes that their house was robbed 17 times in 14 days. No, they didn't. There's another story from Caldwell County, the Globe section. The family had gone out and buried their valuables in the woods and had left one old slave there. And Kirk's men show up and drag him out, demanding to know where the valuables are. And he probably didn't know. And they shot and killed him when he wouldn't confess. We won't ever know all of the things that took place in April of 1865. We're Southern folks. We don't talk about those things. But the war, it was right there. It was not off in some far-flung place. Gettysburg, Chickamauga, Vicksburg. Right there in the mountains of the Blue Ridge. The war eventually ends and Kirk survives. He comes back over here, Greene County, Tennessee, down the road. In 1870, the governor of North Carolina is having a little problem. And he declares 2 counties in North Carolina to be in a state of insurrection. And instead of using the federal troops that are right there in the state of North Carolina, or using other local men, he calls on George W. Kirk. And Kirk recruits a lot of his former soldiers from his regiments. And he goes into Orange County and Randolph County, North Carolina, and he arrests all of these men and he sends them to the federal judge in Salisbury. And a federal officer, U.S. Army officer, later testifies that he personally hears Kirk say that if the judge releases these men, that he will kill every man, woman, and child in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and burn the town to the ground. After about 2 months, Governor Holden declares the insurrection is over, and Kirk's militia is disbanded, and Holden is impeached for the matter, and George W. Kirk is arrested. But the Republican sheriff in Wake County, there in Raleigh, lets Kirk escape one dark night. Kirk works at the U.S. Patent Office in D.C. after this, lives up in the Allegheny Mountains for a while, eventually makes his way to California, where he is tormented by his past. Family member once wrote, as Kirk lay on his deathbed, that he believed that, quote, the devil was coming for him. He even slept with a sword by his side. They wouldn't let people in California have guns then either. George W. Kirk passed away in Gilroy, California on February 15th of 1905. 3 or 4 years ago, I was speaking, I think, at the Tennessee Division reunion. Tim Macy's had me speak several times, and after a while this all runs together. But he called up, we spent the night, he called up to my room. He says, I got somebody down here in the lobby I'd like you to meet. And so I came down there, and it was the president of the local college. I assume it was Tusculum College. He came to play the piano on Sunday afternoons, or Sunday during brunch. And we got to talking about George W. Kirk, and you know what this man told me? He thought George W. Kirk was a hero. And I was speechless for a few minutes. That doesn't usually happen when we talk about the 1860s. I'm pretty good. And I finally stumbled around and said, why don't you come to my side of the mountain? I'd like to introduce you to our superintendent, then superintendent of schools in Avery County. You see, during the war, some of Kirk's men attacked this man's family farm there on Roaring Creek. 3 or 4 of the soldiers, 5 of the soldiers, assaulted this man's great-great-grandmother. And 3 or 4 of them had already left the cabin and were standing in the yard. There was one man left in the cabin, and the woman picked up a pitchfork and ran him through. And she ran out. And his compatriots, he bled out. His compatriots didn't even have the decency to bury him. They just burned the cabin down and went on. I think I would have rather have been at Gettysburg or Chickamauga fighting. Because at those places, I know who the enemy is. It's the guy wearing that blue suit up there on Cemetery Ridge or on Snodgrass Hill, and he's shooting at me. But then again, here in the mountains, probably right here on my side of the mountains where I live, we know who the enemy is too. Because it's usually somebody we're related to. I mean, we're all kin. It's somebody that we went to church with, that we saw at the courthouse or the general store, who's decided that now is a good time to come take everything that I have. I'll finish with 2 stories. Both of these are from Watauga County that illustrate this point. One of them comes from a pension record, and the other one is a family story that was passed down to me. The family story goes like this. In October, I think maybe September, 1863, about the time that the Confederates leave East Tennessee, Knoxville is captured, kind of opens the back door to western North Carolina. 1863, there's a raid in the Bethel community there, not far from the Tennessee line. And the local people have devised this plan where if my farm is being attacked, one of the ladies are going to go upstairs and they're going to blow a horn so the other men in the community can come and help. And that happens in the Bethel community. Paul Farthing's house is being attacked. That house is still there. Thomas Farthing, his brother, lives right up the road. That house is still there too. I've been in that house. Thomas runs home, grabs his rifle, and as he's running down the road, is shot and killed. The raiders break into Paul Farthing's house, break into Thomas Farthing's house. Thomas Farthing's wife, Ermine Halliburton Farthing, is now a widow. After the war is over, Ermine goes to church one Sunday morning, walks through the back door. There's a lady sitting up front wearing her shawl that was stolen in that raid. And she doesn't say anything about it. She just comes in and she sits down. I probably would have said something about it, but she didn't. Second story, and I will close. Take questions. This is near Blowing Rock, there on the south of Boone on the Watauga-Caldwell County line, just outside of Blowing Rock, probably on Blue Ridge Parkway property. There are these 2 men out recruiting. They probably belong to Kirk's command. They're out recruiting. It's January, I think it was 1865. It's early 1865. And these 2 have been to this guy's house, and they're doing their best to say, why don't you come join the Union Army with us? And he just won't commit. So the 2 have come out of the cabin, and they have started to walk when they are ambushed by the home guard. And one of those men is shot twice by the home guard. Shot once, lung, shot another time in the thigh. And one of the home guard members goes to the man that has been shot, the Union recruiter, picks him up, and takes him to that man's mother's house, the Union recruiter's mother's house. It was close by. Bandages his wounds and leaves him. That's how close and personal the war, Western North Carolina and East Tennessee is. Question that I can't answer: what did you do in 1870 when you had to go to court week and you went to church and you're at the general store? How did you live with those people? I've never been able to answer that question. Thank y'all very much.